Hi, I'm Natalie Harper. I thought marriage to my father meant my daughter would finally have the grandmother figure she'd been missing since my mother passed away 3 years ago. Instead, on what should have been Lily's proudest moment at her school award ceremony, my stepmother Victoria decided to humiliate my 8-year-old daughter in front of the entire Riverside Elementary Academy community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The slap echoed through that crowded auditorium like a gunshot, silencing 200 parents and teachers in an instant. But Victoria had no idea she'd just assaulted the child of an FBI director's wife, and what happened next would strip away her carefully constructed facade in ways she never saw coming. The late May afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Riverside Elementary Academy, casting long golden rectangles across the polished floors of the main hallway. The air buzzed with that particular energy that comes at the end of a school year, when children are restless and parents are juggling work schedules to attend yet another school function. I smoothed down my navy blazer and checked my watch, noting that Marcus would be cutting it close as usual. Being married to the FBI director meant that family events often came second to national security briefings, but he'd promised to be here for Lily's academic achievement ceremony. The auditorium was already filling up when I arrived, the familiar chaos of folding chairs scraping against floors and parents saving seats with purses and jackets. I spotted a decent row about halfway back and claimed 3 seats, draping my light cardigan over Marcus's chair and my work tote over the one meant for my father Richard and his wife Victoria. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was saving a seat for the woman who had spent the last 2 years systematically trying to push Lily and me out of my father's life, but family gatherings required a certain level of diplomatic courtesy, something my years as a federal prosecutor had taught me well. Lily bounced up to me from the side entrance where all the award recipients were waiting, her dark curls escaping from the careful braid I'd woven that morning. Her face glowed with excitement, the kind of pure joy that only 8-year-olds can muster when they know they're about to be recognized for something special. She'd worked incredibly hard this year, especially in mathematics, where she'd gone from struggling with basic multiplication to solving complex word problems that challenged some of the 5th graders. "Mommy, did Grandpa Richard come? Did Victoria come too?" Lily asked, her voice carrying that hopeful note that always made my chest tighten. Despite Victoria's coldness toward her, Lily continued to view her as a potential grandmother figure, something she'd been missing since my mother's sudden death from a heart attack when Lily was only 5. "They'll be here soon, sweetheart," I assured her, though I wasn't entirely certain. Victoria had a talent for making excuses when it came to Lily's events, usually citing work obligations or social commitments that somehow always seemed to coincide with my daughter's important moments. "Remember, when they call your name for the Mathematics Excellence Award, walk confidently to the stage and give Mrs. Patterson a firm handshake." Lily nodded seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration as she mentally rehearsed the moment she'd been anticipating for weeks. She darted back toward the staging area, her white dress with tiny blue flowers floating around her knees as she rejoined her classmates. Marcus arrived just as the lights dimmed, sliding into his saved seat with the practiced stealth of someone accustomed to entering rooms without drawing attention. His dark suit was impeccable as always, though I could see the telltale signs of a long day in the slight tension around his eyes and the way he immediately reached for my hand, squeezing it once in greeting. "How was the briefing with the Attorney General?" I whispered, though I knew he couldn't share details even if he wanted to. "Long," he murmured back, his voice carrying that particular exhaustion that came from dealing with matters of national importance. "But I'm here now. Where's the star of the show?" I pointed toward the group of children arranged in the front 2 rows, and Marcus's face softened into the expression he reserved specifically for Lily. Despite not being her biological father, he'd embraced the role of stepfather with a tenderness that sometimes brought tears to my eyes. They'd bonded over weekend hiking trips and bedtime stories about brave agents solving impossible cases. The ceremony began with Principal Dr. Carver's opening remarks about academic excellence and the importance of recognizing student achievement. The auditorium settled into that particular hush of parents trying to balance pride in their own children with polite attention to the recognition of others. Camera phones appeared like magic, held aloft to capture precious moments that would be treasured for years to come. 20 minutes into the program, just as they were announcing the third-grade mathematics awards, my father and Victoria finally arrived. Richard looked slightly out of breath, his silver hair mussed from hurrying, while Victoria appeared perfectly composed in an emerald green dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. They squeezed past other parents in our row, Victoria's heels clicking sharply against the floor, even as she tried to move quietly. "Sorry we're late," Richard whispered, settling into his seat with the apologetic smile I remembered from my childhood. Victoria had a client emergency that ran over. Victoria offered no apology, simply smoothed her dress, and surveyed the room with the calculating gaze of someone assessing property values rather than celebrating children's accomplishments. Her lips were pressed into a thin line that I'd learned to recognize as her default expression whenever she was forced to attend events centered around Lily. The mathematics awards began with kindergarten and worked their way up through the grades. Each child who was called beamed with pride as they walked across the stage, shaking hands with Dr. Carver and receiving their certificate. Parents cheered and applauded. Phones captured every step, and the general atmosphere was one of celebration and community support. When they reached third grade, my heart began to race with anticipation. Lily had earned this recognition through months of extra practice sessions at our kitchen table, working through problem sets with the determination of someone far beyond her years. She'd inherited my analytical mind and Marcus's methodical approach to challenges, creating a combination that served her well in academic pursuits. "The third grade Mathematics Excellence Award goes to Lily Harper," Dr. Carver announced, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. The applause was immediate and warm, the kind of genuine appreciation that small communities show for their children's achievements. I felt tears prick my eyes as Lily stood from her seat in the front row, her posture straight and confident as she began her walk to the stage. Marcus squeezed my hand again, and I could see him discreetly reaching for his phone to record the moment. Lily was halfway to the stage when it happened. Victoria suddenly stood up, her movement so abrupt that her folding chair squeaked in protest. Before I could process what she was doing, she had stepped out of our row and was striding purposefully down the side aisle toward where Lily was walking. The clicking of her heels seemed unnaturally loud in the applauding auditorium, drawing confused glances from other parents. "Lily," Victoria called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the applause. "Come here right now." My daughter stopped walking, her head turning in confusion toward the sound of Victoria's voice. The applause began to fade as people realized something was happening that wasn't part of the planned ceremony. Dr. Carver paused at the podium, certificate still in hand, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Victoria, what are you doing?" I hissed, half rising from my seat, but she was already at Lily's side. What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity of a slow-motion accident. Victoria grabbed Lily's arm, her manicured fingers digging into my daughter's small bicep hard enough that I could see Lily wince from across the room. Without warning, without provocation, without any rational explanation, Victoria drew back her free hand and delivered a sharp, open-palmed slap across Lily's cheek. The sound cracked through the auditorium like a whip. 200 people fell into absolute silence. Parents froze with their cameras still raised. Children stopped fidgeting in their seats. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause in shock. The only sound was Lily's sharp intake of breath, followed immediately by the kind of sob that comes from complete bewilderment rather than just physical pain. Time crystallized into that single horrible moment. My 8-year-old daughter, wearing her favorite dress and standing in front of her entire school community, had just been publicly humiliated and physically assaulted by the woman who was supposed to be her step-grandmother. The Mathematics Excellence Certificate fluttered from Dr. Carver's shocked hands to the stage floor. The rage that flooded through me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. During my years as a federal prosecutor, I'd maintained professional composure while dealing with the worst criminals society had to offer. I'd cross-examined murderers and faced down organized crime figures without losing my cool. But watching Victoria's hand connect with my daughter's face triggered something primal and protective that bypassed every rational thought in my brain. I was on my feet and moving before conscious decision entered the equation. Behind me, I heard Marcus's sharp intake of breath and the scrape of his chair as he stood as well, but my entire focus was on reaching Lily, who stood frozen in the middle of the aisle with her hand pressed to her reddening cheek and tears streaming down her face. "Don't you ever," I began, my voice carrying across the silent auditorium with prosecutorial authority, "lay a hand on my daughter again." Victoria spun to face me, her green eyes flashing with something between defiance and shock at her own actions. For just a moment, I saw uncertainty flicker across her features, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd just done either. But then her expression hardened into the cold mask I'd come to know over the past 2 years. "That child has no respect," Victoria snapped, her voice loud enough that the microphone on the stage picked it up and amplified it throughout the room. "Walking around like she owns the place, acting like she's special. Someone needed to teach her proper behavior." The collective gasp from the audience was audible. Parents began whispering to each other.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Phones appeared as people started recording what was clearly becoming a confrontation that would be talked about for years to come. Dr. Carver abandoned the podium and was making her way down from the stage, her face pale with the realization that her school's awards ceremony had just become a family crisis playing out in public. I reached Lily and immediately knelt beside her, gathering her small, trembling body against me while keeping my eyes fixed on Victoria. My daughter's tears soaked through the shoulder of my blazer, and I could feel her little heart racing against my chest like a frightened bird. "It's okay, baby," I murmured into her hair, though nothing about this situation was remotely okay. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing at all." Marcus appeared at my other side, his presence solid and reassuring, even as I could feel the controlled fury radiating from him. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority that came from years of commanding rooms full of federal agents and briefing presidents on matters of national security. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, and the formal address made Victoria's eyes widen slightly, as if she was just remembering exactly who she'd chosen to cross. "I think you need to step back and reconsider what just happened here." Victoria straightened her shoulders, clearly preparing to double down on her actions rather than acknowledge any wrongdoing. The emerald dress that had looked so elegant when she arrived now seemed gaudy and inappropriate, like costume jewelry trying to pass for real gems. "I will not be lectured by anyone about how to handle family discipline," she declared, her voice carrying that particular pitch that indicated she was about to make the situation significantly worse. "That child has been allowed to run wild for far too long, and if Natalie won't provide proper structure, then someone else needs to step in." The auditorium had become a theater, with 200 people watching our family drama unfold in real time. I could see Miss Torres, Lily's teacher, standing near the side entrance with her hand over her mouth in shock. Other parents were pulling out their phones more openly now, no longer pretending they weren't documenting every word and gesture. Dr. Carver finally reached us, her professional demeanor intact, despite the unprecedented situation unfolding in her school. "Perhaps we should move this conversation to my office," she suggested diplomatically, though her eyes were focused on Lily with obvious concern. "There are procedures we need to follow when there's been an incident involving a child." "Incident?" Victoria laughed, a sharp sound that carried no humor whatsoever. "I gave a spoiled child a reality check. In my day, that was called parenting." That was the moment when Marcus stepped forward, and I watched Victoria's expression change as she truly registered for the first time who she was dealing with. My husband had a particular way of moving when he shifted from family mode into FBI director mode, a subtle but unmistakable transformation that had intimidated senators and foreign ambassadors. His posture straightened, his expression became professionally neutral, and his voice took on the tone that had delivered briefings to 3 different presidents. "Mrs. Brennan," he said again, and this time there was steel beneath the silk. "You have just committed assault against a minor in front of 200 witnesses, in a public venue, with multiple recording devices capturing evidence of your actions. I would suggest very carefully considering your next words." The color began to drain from Victoria's face, as the full implications of the situation started to penetrate her anger. Around us, I could hear parents whispering more urgently, phones being shifted for better recording angles, and the general stirring of a crowd that sensed something significant was happening. My father, who had been sitting in stunned silence since Victoria's explosive action, finally found his voice. "Victoria, what have you done?" Richard's words came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the absolute quiet of the auditorium, they carried clearly. "That's my granddaughter. That's Lily." For the first time since the slap, Victoria seemed to realize that her actions might have consequences beyond the immediate moment. Her gaze darted around the room, taking in the sea of shocked faces. The phones pointed in her direction, and the very official presence of the FBI director standing protectively beside the child she'd just struck. Dr. Carver cleared her throat diplomatically. "Given the circumstances, I think it would be best if we move this discussion to a more private setting while we determine the appropriate next steps. There are protocols to follow when there's been an altercation involving a student." I looked down at Lily, who had stopped crying but was still pressed against my side like she was trying to disappear entirely. Her cheek bore the clear outline of Victoria's hand, a red mark that would probably fade within the hour, but would remain seared in my memory forever. "Lily, sweetheart," I said gently, lifting her chin so I could meet her eyes. "Do you want to go get your certificate? You earned that award, and nothing that just happened changes how proud I am of you." My daughter's lower lip trembled, but she nodded bravely. Hand in hand, we walked to the stage where Dr. Carver had retrieved the fallen certificate. The auditorium remained unnaturally quiet as Lily climbed the steps and finally received the recognition she'd worked so hard to earn. When she shook Dr. Carver's hand, the principal bent down to whisper something in her ear that made Lily's face brighten just slightly. The applause that followed was different from what had greeted the other award recipients. It was fierce and protective, the sound of a community rallying around a child who had been wronged. Parents weren't just clapping for academic achievement anymore. They were making a statement about what kind of behavior they would and wouldn't tolerate in their shared space. As we walked back down from the stage, I caught sight of Marcus speaking quietly but intensely with Dr. Carver and Officer Kim, the school's security resource officer. Victoria stood isolated near our row of seats, my father beside her with his head in his hands. The other parents in nearby seats had subtly shifted away from them, creating a visible buffer zone around the woman who had just shown her true character in the most public way possible. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. What should have been a celebration of children's academic achievements had become something else entirely. A community gathering where lines had been drawn and allegiances established in real time. Parents kept glancing our way, some offering supportive smiles, others clearly eager to discuss what they'd witnessed the moment they got to their cars. When the official program finally ended, the usual rush of families gathering for photos and congratulations was subdued. People moved more quietly, spoke in lower voices, and kept stealing glances at Victoria, who remained standing in the same spot, as if frozen by the magnitude of what she'd done. Miss Torres approached us as we prepared to leave, her expression mixing professional concern with personal warmth. "Lily," she said, crouching down to my daughter's eye level, "I want you to know that you handled that situation with incredible maturity and grace. Your math skills aren't the only thing that makes you special." Lily managed a small smile, the first genuine expression of happiness she'd shown since the slap. "Thank you, Ms. Torres. Will I still be in your advanced math group next year?" "Absolutely," her teacher assured her. "You've earned that spot through hard work and dedication, and nothing can take that away from you." As we finally made our way toward the exit, Dr. Carver intercepted us near the auditorium doors. Her expression was professionally sympathetic, but also unmistakably serious. "Mr. and Mrs. Harper," she said quietly, "given what occurred here tonight, I'll need to file a mandatory report with Child Protective Services. It's standard protocol when there's been a physical altercation involving a student on school property. I want you to know that this is purely procedural, and based on what I witnessed, I have no concerns about Lily's safety in your care." Marcus nodded grimly. "We understand, Dr. Carver. Please do whatever you need to do. We'll be available for any follow-up that's required." As we walked across the parking lot toward our car, Lily between us holding both our hands, I could feel the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. The late afternoon sun that had seemed so warm and promising when I had arrived now felt harsh and exposing, highlighting the surreal nature of how quickly our evening had transformed from celebration to crisis. "Mommy," Lily said as Marcus unlocked the car, "why did Victoria hit me? I was just walking to get my award like you taught me." The question hung in the warm spring air, as innocent and devastating as only a child's inquiry could be. I knelt beside the car door, taking her small hands in mine while searching for words that could explain the unexplainable without destroying her faith in the basic goodness of family relationships. "Sometimes adults make very bad choices, sweetheart," I said carefully. "What Victoria did was wrong, and it had nothing to do with you or anything you did. You were perfect up there. You walked exactly like we practiced, and you earned that award through your own hard work." Lily nodded solemnly, processing this information with the serious consideration she brought to complex math problems. "Is Victoria going to get in trouble like kids do when they hit someone at school?" I glanced up at Marcus, who was standing beside the car with his phone in his hand, his expression grim as he scrolled through what I assumed were work messages that couldn't wait even for family crises. "Yes, baby," I said finally. "Adults have to follow rules too, and when they break them, there are consequences." As we drove home through the familiar streets of Westfield, passing the manicured lawns and elegant houses that defined our affluent suburban neighborhood, I found myself thinking about consequences and the way they rippled outward from single moments of poor judgment. Victoria had made a choice in that auditorium, a split-second decision that revealed something ugly and cruel beneath her carefully maintained exterior. But she had no idea yet how far those ripples would spread, or how dramatically they would alter the comfortable life she'd built as Mrs. Richard Brennan. Marcus was unusually quiet during the drive home, his jaw set in the way that indicated he was working through scenarios and possibilities in his mind. After 15 years of marriage, I could read the signs that meant he was shifting into problem-solving mode, considering angles and implications that most people wouldn't think to examine. When we pulled into our driveway, the normalcy of home felt surreal after the chaos of the school auditorium. Our house looked exactly the same as it had when we'd left 2 hours earlier, but everything had changed. Lily ran straight upstairs to change out of her dress, calling back that she wanted to show her certificate to her goldfish, Mr. Bubbles, who she was convinced would be impressed by her academic achievement. Marcus and I stood in our kitchen, the familiar space suddenly feeling like a war room where strategies would be planned and decisions made that would affect not just our family, but potentially Victoria's entire future. "She has no idea what she's just done," Marcus said quietly, setting his phone on the granite countertop with more force than necessary. "Assaulting a child in public, in front of hundreds of witnesses, with multiple recordings of the incident. And not just any child. Our child." I poured myself a glass of water with hands that were still slightly shaking from adrenaline. "She's been building up to something like this for months." The snide comments, the way she talks to Lily when she thinks I'm not listening, the constant undermining. "But I never thought she'd actually put her hands on her." "Well, she did," Marcus replied, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant he was already several steps ahead in his thinking. "And now we have decisions to make about how we respond. Because make no mistake, Natalie, this isn't over. What happened tonight was just the opening move." Outside our kitchen windows, the sun was finally setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Somewhere across town, Victoria was probably trying to justify her actions to my father, spinning a narrative that would make her the victim of an overreactive family. But what she didn't know yet was that she'd crossed a line with people who had the resources, connections, and determination to ensure that actions had appropriate consequences. The real reckoning was still to come. The morning after the awards ceremony dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of Virginia spring weather that matched my mood perfectly. I stood at the kitchen window, watching raindrops streak down the glass while my coffee grew cold in my hands. Lily had slept fitfully, waking twice from nightmares where faceless people were angry with her for reasons she couldn't understand. Each time, I'd held her until she drifted back to sleep. But my own rest had been elusive, my mind churning through the implications of what Victoria had done. Marcus had left for the office before dawn, called away by what his assistant described as an urgent briefing that couldn't wait. Before kissing me goodbye, he'd squeezed my shoulder and said simply, "Today we start documenting everything." The words carried weight that went far beyond their surface meaning, and I knew that my husband was already several moves ahead in a game that Victoria didn't even realize she was playing. By 8:30, I was sitting in Dr. Carver's office at Riverside Elementary Academy, the same space where I'd attended parent-teacher conferences and discussed Lily's academic progress under far more pleasant circumstances. The principal's office felt different this morning, charged with the gravity of what we needed to discuss. Dr. Carver had rearranged her morning schedule to accommodate this meeting, understanding that the events of the previous evening required immediate attention. Officer Kim was present as well, his uniform lending an official weight to the proceedings that made everything feel surreal. I'd known Daniel Kim for 3 years, had chatted with him at school functions and appreciated his gentle way with the children, but seeing him in his role as a law enforcement officer investigating an incident involving my daughter created a strange cognitive dissonance. "Mrs. Harper," Dr. Carver began, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that administrators master when dealing with sensitive situations. "I want to assure you that we're taking last night's incident very seriously. Officer Kim and I have reviewed the security footage from the auditorium, and we have clear documentation of what occurred." She turned her computer monitor so I could see the screen, and despite having lived through the moment, watching it play out in silent digital replay was somehow worse than experiencing it in real time. The footage captured everything with clinical clarity: Victoria's sudden movement from her seat, her aggressive approach to Lily, the grab, and then the unmistakable motion of her hand striking my daughter's face. The timestamp showed the entire sequence lasted less than 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds had altered our family dynamics permanently. I've also received statements from Ms. Torres and 3 other teachers who witnessed the incident, Dr. Carver continued, turning the screen back toward herself. Their accounts are consistent with what the video shows. Additionally, several parents have contacted me this morning to offer their own witness statements if needed. Officer Kim leaned forward in his chair, his expression professionally sympathetic but serious. "Mrs. Harper, based on the evidence we have, there are grounds for criminal charges if you choose to pursue them. What occurred last night meets the legal definition of assault, regardless of any family relationship between the perpetrator and the victim." The weight of that statement settled over me like a heavy blanket. Criminal charges. Against my father's wife, the woman who, despite her flaws and increasing hostility, was still technically family. The prosecutor in me understood the legal framework perfectly, but the daughter in me recoiled from the implications of what such a path would mean for my relationship with my father. "What exactly would that process involve?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer from my years in federal court. "We would file a formal complaint with the magistrate," Officer Kim explained. "Given the public nature of the incident and the amount of documentation we have, it would likely proceed quickly through the initial stages. Mrs. Brennan would be formally charged, arraigned, and required to appear in court." Dr. Carver cleared her throat gently. "There's also the matter of the school's response to consider. We have policies regarding individuals who pose a potential threat to student safety. Based on last night's events, I'll need to implement a formal restriction barring Mrs. Brennan from school property, pending the resolution of this matter." The administrative efficiency of it all felt both reassuring and overwhelming. Systems were clicking into place, procedures were being followed, and Victoria's single moment of poor judgment was generating consequences that would ripple through multiple institutions. Yet underneath the professional competence, I could sense that both Dr. Carver and Officer Kim were personally affected by what they'd witnessed. They'd seen an adult strike a child for no apparent reason, and their protective instincts were engaged, just as mine had been. "I need some time to think about the criminal charges," I said finally. "This involves my father as well, and I want to consider all the implications before making that decision." Both officials nodded understandingly, though I caught a slight exchange of glances between them that suggested they'd expected this response. Family situations complicated everything, creating emotional and relational dynamics that didn't exist in straightforward criminal cases. Of course, Dr. Carver said. There's no rush on that decision. However, I do need to let you know that I've filed the mandatory report with Child Protective Services, as required by state law. A caseworker will be contacting you within the next few days to follow up. After leaving the school, I drove aimlessly through Westfield's quiet suburban streets, trying to process the morning's revelations. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, creating that peculiar gray light that made everything look washed out and slightly unreal. I found myself pulling into the parking lot of Silver Lake Park, the same place where Marcus and I had brought Lily for countless weekend picnics and where she'd learned to ride her bike without training wheels. The park was nearly empty on this weekday morning, just a few dedicated joggers and dog walkers going about their routines. I sat on a bench overlooking the small lake, watching ducks paddle contentedly across the still water, and tried to organize my thoughts into some kind of coherent plan. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Grace Romano, who had been at the ceremony the night before and witnessed the entire incident. Coffee later? I have some information you might find interesting. Grace worked as a real estate attorney in the same legal community where I'd built my career as a prosecutor, and her network of professional contacts often proved valuable in unexpected ways. I texted back, agreeing to meet her for lunch, then sat for another 20 minutes watching the ducks and thinking about the strange turns that life could take in the span of a single evening. 24 hours ago, my biggest concern had been whether Marcus would make it to Lily's ceremony on time. Now I was contemplating criminal charges against a family member and trying to figure out how to protect my daughter from further emotional damage. The drive home took me past my father's house in the Oak Hills subdivision, a stately colonial that Victoria had insisted they purchase when they married 2 years ago. I'd always suspected she'd pushed for the move to establish distance from Lily and me, creating physical space that reflected the emotional barriers she'd been building since she entered our family. The house looked perfectly maintained from the outside, Victoria's real estate background evident in every carefully chosen landscape element and architectural detail. On impulse, I pulled into their driveway. My father answered the door looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His usually neat silver hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them, and his eyes carried the particular exhaustion that comes from spending hours in difficult conversations. Behind him, I could hear the sound of Victoria's voice, sharp and defensive, though I couldn't make out the words. "Natalie," he said, his voice heavy with something between relief and dread. "I was hoping you'd come by. We need to talk." The interior of the house felt cold despite the warm spring weather outside. Victoria had decorated it in shades of cream and beige that looked elegant in magazines but felt sterile in person, as if no real life was supposed to happen in these carefully arranged spaces. Family photos were strategically placed but somehow impersonal, like props in a staged home rather than genuine memories of shared experiences. Victoria emerged from the kitchen as I entered the living room, her appearance as perfectly composed as always despite the circumstances. She'd clearly spent considerable time on her hair and makeup, as if preparing for a business meeting rather than confronting the aftermath of her assault on my daughter. Her green eyes held no trace of remorse, only a calculating wariness that suggested she was already planning her defense strategy. "I suppose you're here to gloat," she said without preamble, her voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured victimhood that I'd learned to recognize over the past 2 years. "To rub it in that you've turned the whole community against me over a simple misunderstanding." The audacity of framing her actions as a simple misunderstanding momentarily robbed me of speech. I looked at my father, hoping to see some sign that he'd confronted the reality of what his wife had done, but his expression remained carefully neutral, in the way of someone trying to keep peace at any cost. "Victoria," I said, settling into one of her uncomfortable designer chairs and crossing my legs with deliberate calm. "You slapped my 8-year-old daughter in front of 200 people at her school awards ceremony. There's nothing simple or misunderstood about that action." She waved her hand dismissively as if brushing away an inconvenient detail. "Children need discipline. They need to learn that actions have consequences, and that the world doesn't revolve around them. Lily has been spoiled and indulged for far too long, and someone needed to provide some structure." My father shifted uncomfortably in his armchair, his gaze fixed on his hands rather than meeting either of our eyes. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filled with the weight of things that needed to be said but weren't being voiced. "What actions, specifically?" I asked, my prosecutorial training kicking in automatically. What had Lily done that warranted being struck across the face in public? Victoria's perfectly applied lipstick couldn't hide the thin line her mouth formed when she was preparing to deliver what she considered a devastating argument. She was showing off, walking up there like she owned the place, expecting everyone to fawn over her for doing the bare minimum in school. That kind of arrogance needs to be corrected before it becomes a permanent character flaw. The twisted logic was almost breathtaking in its cruelty. Victoria had somehow transformed an 8-year-old's proud walk to receive an academic achievement award into evidence of character defects that required physical correction. It was the kind of reasoning that revealed so much about the person making it that I found myself momentarily fascinated by the psychology involved. "She was walking to receive a Mathematics Excellence Award," I said slowly, as if explaining something complex to someone with limited comprehension. "She was doing exactly what every other award recipient did, exactly what the ceremony was designed for children to do." Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Of course you'd defend her. You've never been able to see your own daughter objectively. She manipulates you with those big eyes and that innocent act, and you fall for it every time." My father finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Victoria, please. She's 8 years old. 8 years old and already learning that she can get away with anything because Mommy and her important husband will always take her side," Victoria shot back, her composure finally starting to crack around the edges. "Well, I'm not going to enable that kind of behavior. Someone in this family needs to have standards." I stood up slowly, recognizing that this conversation had revealed everything I needed to know about Victoria's mindset and her complete lack of remorse for her actions. She wasn't apologetic. She was defensive. She wasn't reconsidering her behavior. She was doubling down on it. Most tellingly, she wasn't seeing Lily as a child who deserved protection and kindness, but as a rival who needed to be diminished. "I came here hoping to find some indication that you understood the severity of what you did last night," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "Instead, I've learned that you believe striking my daughter was not only justified but necessary. That tells me everything I need to know about how to proceed." Victoria's eyes narrowed, and I could see her calculating mind working to assess the threat level in my words. "Proceed with what?" "With protecting my daughter from further harm," I replied simply. "By whatever means necessary." The drive to meet Grace for lunch took me through the heart of downtown Westfield, past the boutique shops and coffee houses that served our affluent community. On any other day, I might have stopped to browse or grab a latte, but today the familiar streets felt like a stage set where everyone was playing roles in a drama they didn't fully understand. Grace was already waiting when I arrived at the Potomac Grill, her dark hair pulled back in the efficient bun she wore for client meetings, her expression mixing professional curiosity with personal concern. We'd been friends since law school, had served as each other's bridesmaids, and had navigated the challenges of balancing demanding careers with family life together. If anyone could provide both emotional support and practical advice, it was Grace. "You look like hell," she said without preamble as I slid into the booth across from her. Which is understandable, given what happened last night. "The whole town is talking about it." "What are they saying?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. Grace stirred her iced tea thoughtfully. "Mixed reactions, mostly along the lines you'd expect. The parents who know Lily are horrified and supportive of you. The people who don't know your family personally are confused and looking for context. But here's the interesting part. Victoria's behavior last night apparently wasn't as out of character as you might think." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the table toward me. "I made some calls this morning to colleagues in the real estate community. Turns out your stepmother has quite a reputation for aggressive behavior with clients, contractors, and pretty much anyone who gets in her way." The folder contained printouts of online reviews, professional complaints, and what appeared to be screenshots of social media posts. As I flipped through the pages, a pattern emerged that was both enlightening and disturbing. Victoria's professional interactions were characterized by a consistent thread of hostility toward anyone she perceived as challenging her authority or threatening her interests. "Look at page 3, Grace said, pointing to a particularly detailed review from a homebuyer. This woman describes Victoria becoming, quote, irrationally aggressive when the inspection revealed problems with a property she was representing. Apparently, she screamed at the buyer and the inspector, then tried to pressure them into waiving their right to negotiate repairs. I read through the review with growing amazement. The language the buyer used to describe Victoria's behavior was remarkably similar to what I'd witnessed at the awards ceremony: sudden escalation, disproportionate anger, and a complete inability to accept that her actions were inappropriate. There are more," Grace continued, flipping to additional pages. 3 separate contractors have filed complaints with the real estate board about her treatment of workers at properties she's shown. 2 other agents have documented instances of her becoming physically aggressive during negotiations. There's even a police report from last year where she was accused of keying a competitor's car in a parking lot dispute. The evidence painted a picture of someone whose public facade of elegance and professionalism concealed a pattern of volatile behavior that surfaced whenever she felt challenged or thwarted. It also suggested that her assault on Lily wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment, but rather the latest manifestation of a consistent inability to control her temper when things didn't go her way. "This is incredibly helpful," I said, closing the folder carefully. "It establishes a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond family tensions." Grace leaned forward, her expression serious. "There's something else." I reached out to a friend who works in family court, just to get some perspective on how these kinds of cases typically play out. She said that with this much documentation and this many witnesses, any judge would take the incident very seriously, especially given Lily's age and the public nature of the assault. Our lunch arrived, but I found I had little appetite despite having eaten nothing since dinner the previous night. The information Grace had gathered was valuable, but it also made the situation feel more real and more serious than it had seemed even that morning. "Have you decided whether to press criminal charges?" Grace asked, her voice gentle but direct. I pushed my salad around my plate, considering the question that had been haunting me since my conversation with Officer Kim. Part of me wants to let it go for my father's sake. He's already going through enough, and criminal charges would make everything so much more complicated. And the other part of you? The other part of me is furious that she put her hands on my daughter and then showed no remorse whatsoever. The other part of me knows that if I don't take a strong stand now, she'll interpret my restraint as weakness, and the behavior will escalate. Grace nodded slowly. "From everything you've told me about Victoria over the past 2 years, she doesn't seem like someone who responds well to gentle correction or family conversations. She seems like someone who only understands consequences." After lunch, I drove to Marcus's office at the FBI headquarters in downtown D.C., a trip that usually felt routine but today carried additional weight. The imposing federal building represented not just my husband's workplace, but also the full resources of the United States government that could be brought to bear when someone threatened a federal official's family. Marcus's assistant, Patricia Wells, greeted me with the sympathetic efficiency of someone who had already been briefed on the situation. "He's expecting you," she said, ushering me directly into his corner office with its panoramic view of the capital city. "He cleared his afternoon schedule after you called." My husband looked up from a stack of classified briefing papers as I entered, his expression shifting immediately from professional concentration to personal concern. The transformation reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him 15 years ago: his ability to be completely present in whatever role the moment required, whether that was National Security Director or protective stepfather. "How did the meeting at school go?" he asked, standing to embrace me in the kind of hug that conveyed both comfort and strength. I filled him in on the morning's conversations, sharing the details of Dr. Carver's documentation and Officer Kim's assessment of the legal options available. Marcus listened with the focused attention he brought to intelligence briefings, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly letting me process the information out loud. "And Victoria?" he asked when I finished recounting the school meeting. Completely unrepentant, I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. She's convinced that she was justified in hitting Lily, and that we're all overreacting. She sees herself as the victim in this situation. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The only outward sign of the anger I knew was building beneath his professionally controlled exterior. That's actually helpful information. It tells us that we're not dealing with someone who made a mistake and regrets it. We're dealing with someone who believes her actions were appropriate and would likely repeat them given the opportunity. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes, his handwriting neat and methodical. Tell me about your conversation with Grace. I shared the contents of the folder Grace had assembled, watching Marcus's expression grow increasingly serious as I described the pattern of aggressive behavior Victoria had exhibited in her professional life. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and studied his notes for a long moment. This changes the calculus significantly, he said finally. What we're looking at isn't an isolated incident of poor judgment during a stressful family moment. This is evidence of an individual with a documented history of volatile behavior who has now escalated to physical violence against a child. The clinical assessment was both reassuring and alarming. Reassuring because it validated my instincts about the seriousness of the situation, but alarming because it suggested that Victoria represented a more significant threat than I'd initially realized. There's something else, Marcus continued, pulling a thin file from his desk drawer. I asked our background investigation unit to run a routine check on Victoria this morning, just to see if there was anything in her history that might be relevant to this situation. He slid the file across the desk, and I opened it to find a standard background report of the type used for security clearances and federal employment. Most of the information was routine: birth certificate, education records, employment history, but there were several entries that made me pause. Look at the section on civil litigation, Marcus said, pointing to a specific page. Victoria had been involved in 7 different civil lawsuits over the past 15 years, ranging from contract disputes to personal injury claims. Most concerning was a restraining order that had been filed against her by a former neighbor, alleging harassment and threatening behavior that had escalated over a property line dispute. The restraining order was dismissed after 6 months, Marcus explained, but the filing documents describe behavior that's remarkably consistent with what we witnessed last night: sudden escalation, disproportionate anger, and physical intimidation tactics. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, feeling overwhelmed by the mounting evidence that Victoria's assault on Lily was part of a much larger pattern of problematic behavior. What had initially seemed like a family crisis was beginning to look like a more serious situation that required careful handling. What are you thinking? I asked, recognizing the expression on Marcus's face that meant he was several steps ahead in his strategic planning. I'm thinking that we need to be very deliberate about how we respond to this situation, he said, standing and walking to the window that overlooked the city. Victoria has shown us who she really is, and we need to take that information seriously. But we also need to be smart about how we use it. The afternoon sun was beginning to break through the clouds outside, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the office walls. Somewhere in the city below, Victoria was probably going about her normal routine, convinced that the previous night's events would blow over with time and family diplomacy. She had no idea that her single moment of violence had triggered a comprehensive review of her entire background, or that she was now dealing with people who had access to resources and information far beyond anything she'd encountered in her previous conflicts. I want to file the criminal charges, I said suddenly, the words coming out with more certainty than I'd felt all day. Not out of revenge, but because it's the right thing to do. If she'd done this to any other child, I wouldn't hesitate to support prosecution. The fact that she's family doesn't change the fundamental right of children to be safe from adult violence. Marcus turned from the window and smiled, the expression mixing pride with determination. I was hoping you'd reach that conclusion, because I think it's time Victoria learned that actions really do have consequences, especially when you assault the family of an FBI director. The drive home through rush-hour traffic gave me time to process the day's revelations and prepare for the conversation I would need to have with Lily about the steps we were taking to ensure her safety. The weight of evidence against Victoria was overwhelming, but more importantly, it painted a clear picture of someone who posed a genuine threat to my daughter's well-being. As I pulled into our driveway, I could see Lily through the kitchen window, sitting at the table with her homework spread out around her, looking like any normal third grader working on math problems. The normalcy of the scene was both comforting and heartbreaking, a reminder of what we were fighting to protect. The real battle was just beginning. The magistrate's office in downtown Westfield was a study in bureaucratic efficiency, all beige walls and fluorescent lighting designed to strip emotion from legal proceedings. I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, watching Officer Kim complete the formal paperwork that would transform last night's assault from a family incident into an official criminal matter. The weight of the decision settled around me like a heavy coat, but underneath the apprehension was a growing sense of certainty that this was the right path forward. "Mrs. Harper," the magistrate said, looking up from the documents with the neutral expression of someone who processed dozens of similar cases each week. "I want to make sure you understand the implications of filing these charges. Once we proceed, this becomes a matter for the court system to resolve. You won't be able to simply change your mind if family dynamics become complicated." I nodded, my hands folded carefully in my lap. "I understand completely. This isn't a decision I've made lightly, but it's the right one. My daughter deserves to know that adults who hurt children face consequences for their actions." The magistrate stamped the final page with a sound that seemed to echo through the small office, making everything official and irreversible. "Mrs. Brennan will be notified of the charges and required to appear for arraignment within the next 10 days. The court will send notice to her registered address." Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a strange mixture of relief and trepidation. The machinery of justice was now in motion, grinding forward with its own momentum regardless of family politics or personal relationships. Victoria would soon discover that her assault on Lily had consequences far beyond anything she'd anticipated. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus as I reached my car. "How did it go?" Followed immediately by, "I'm proud of you for doing the right thing." I was typing a response when another message came through, this one from a number I didn't recognize. "You're making a huge mistake. Family business should stay in the family. Some things are better left alone." The anonymous nature of the message was almost as unsettling as its content, and I screenshot it before forwarding it to Marcus with a note asking if we should be concerned about Victoria attempting to intimidate me. His response was immediate. "Forward all communications like this directly to Agent Crawford. We're documenting everything now." The shift from viewing this as a family matter to treating it as a potential criminal conspiracy felt surreal, but the anonymous message had crossed a line that changed the entire dynamic. Someone was trying to pressure me into backing down, and the timing suggested coordination rather than coincidence. I drove to Lily's school to pick her up from aftercare, my mind churning through the implications of the anonymous message and what it might mean for our family's safety. The familiar routine of navigating the pickup line and scanning for my daughter among the clusters of children felt comforting after the morning's intensity, a reminder that despite everything happening in the adult world, Lily's childhood needed to continue as normally as possible. She climbed into the car with her usual enthusiasm, backpack trailing behind her, and a slightly sticky art project clutched in her free hand. "Look what I made in art class," she announced, holding up a watercolor painting that appeared to depict our family standing in front of a rainbow. Ms. Peterson said it shows good emotional processing. The innocent pride in her voice made my chest tighten with protective fury. This was what Victoria had tried to destroy with her public humiliation, this pure joy in simple accomplishments and faith in the basic goodness of family relationships. The fact that Lily was still creating hopeful art despite what she'd experienced spoke to a resilience that made me even more determined to ensure she never faced such treatment again. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, carefully taking the painting and propping it against the dashboard where we could both see it. "Tell me about the people in the picture." Lily settled into her booster seat, buckling her seatbelt with the careful precision she'd been practicing. "That's you, and that's Marcus, and that's me, and we're all holding hands because we take care of each other." Ms. Peterson said families are like teams, and good teams protect all their players. The simple wisdom of 8-year-old logic cut straight to the heart of everything we were fighting for. Lily understood intuitively what Victoria seemed incapable of grasping. that families were supposed to be safe spaces, where vulnerable members were protected, not attacked. "What about Grandpa Richard?" I asked gently, curious about how she was processing the complex family dynamics involved in the situation. Lily's expression grew thoughtful, her small face scrunching up in the way it did when she was working through a difficult math problem. I wanted to put him in the picture, but I didn't know where Victoria should go. Miss Peterson said sometimes people make bad choices that hurt other people, and then we have to figure out how to stay safe while still being loving. The sophistication of her emotional reasoning was both impressive and heartbreaking. At 8 years old, she was already learning to navigate the complex territory of loving someone whose partner posed a threat to her well-being. It was a lesson no child should have to master, but Lily was approaching it with the same methodical intelligence she brought to her academic work. We stopped at the grocery store on the way home, and I found myself hyper-aware of our surroundings in a way that felt foreign and unsettling. Every person who glanced in our direction seemed potentially threatening. Every car that followed the same route felt suspicious. The anonymous message had introduced an element of paranoia that I struggled to keep from affecting Lily's perception of her environment. In the cereal aisle, we encountered Mrs. Patterson, Lily's former kindergarten teacher, who immediately enveloped my daughter in one of her famous hugs. "How is my favorite mathematician doing?" she asked, crouching down to Lily's eye level with the genuine enthusiasm that had made her beloved by generations of Riverside Elementary students. "I got an award for mathematics excellence," Lily announced, her face lighting up with renewed pride in her achievement. "It was really exciting until Victoria got angry about something." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and I realized that news of the incident had spread through the close-knit community of school staff faster than I'd anticipated. Her eyes met mine over Lily's head with a look of sympathetic understanding mixed with protective concern. "Awards are for celebrating," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, her voice maintaining the warm tone children expected while conveying subtle support to me. "When we work hard and achieve something special, the people who love us should be proud and happy. That's how families are supposed to work." After we finished shopping and loaded our groceries into the car, Lily asked the question I'd been dreading. "Mommy, is Victoria gonna get in trouble for hitting me? Like, real trouble that grown-ups get?" I turned around in the driver's seat to face her, wanting to give this conversation the attention it deserved. "Yes, baby. Adults have rules about how they treat children, and when they break those rules, there are consequences. Victoria will have to go to court and explain to a judge why she thought it was okay to hit you." Lily absorbed this information with the same serious consideration she gave to complex word problems. "Will Grandpa Richard be sad?" The question struck at the heart of my own conflicted feelings about the situation. "Grandpa Richard might be sad that this is happening, but I think he'll understand that we need to keep you safe. Sometimes protecting the people we love means making difficult choices." That evening, after Lily was settled in bed with her favorite book and Mr. Bubbles had been fed his nightly portion of fish flakes, Marcus and I sat in our living room planning our next moves with the systematic approach he brought to national security briefings. The coffee table was covered with documents, legal pads, and printed emails, transforming our comfortable family space into a makeshift command center. "Agent Crawford confirmed that the anonymous message you received came from a burner phone purchased with cash yesterday afternoon," Marcus reported, reading from his notes. "The store's security cameras show a woman matching Victoria's general description making the purchase, though the footage isn't clear enough for positive identification." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air conditioning. So she's escalating beyond the assault itself. She's trying to intimidate me into dropping the charges. "It appears that way," Marcus agreed, his voice carrying the controlled anger that I'd learned to recognize over our years of marriage. Which tells us several important things about her mindset and her assessment of the situation. She believes she can pressure you into backing down, she's willing to engage in potentially criminal behavior to achieve that goal, and she's underestimating our resources and determination. Agent Crawford arrived at 8:30, transforming our living room gathering into an official FBI consultation. James Crawford was one of Marcus's most trusted investigators, a veteran agent whose unassuming appearance concealed a sharp analytical mind and encyclopedic knowledge of criminal behavior patterns. I'd met him at several bureau social events, but seeing him in our home in a professional capacity felt surreal. Mrs. Harper, he began, settling into our armchair with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to taking charge of complex situations. I want to walk through everything that's happened since the initial incident, focusing particularly on any communications or contact attempts from Mrs. Brennan or anyone acting on her behalf. I recounted the morning's events in detail, from the meeting at school through my confrontation with Victoria at my father's house, to the anonymous message I'd received after filing charges. Agent Crawford took notes in a small notebook, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed his understanding of intimidation tactics and witness pressure strategies. The pattern is fairly typical, he said when I finished. An initial assessment period where the perpetrator gauges the victim's likely response, followed by escalating pressure tactics if the victim appears willing to pursue formal consequences. The anonymous messaging suggests she's moving into the intimidation phase. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting into the focused intensity I'd seen him display during crisis briefings. What's our best strategy for protecting Natalie and Lily while ensuring that Victoria faces appropriate consequences for both the assault and the attempted intimidation? Agent Crawford flipped through his notes thoughtfully. Short term, we implement standard protective protocols for family members of federal officials who are facing credible threats. Long term, we document everything Victoria does and ensure that her escalating behavior becomes part of the criminal case against her. The conversation continued for another hour, covering security measures, documentation procedures, and contingency plans for various scenarios. By the time Agent Crawford left, our quiet suburban evening had been transformed into something resembling a federal investigation, complete with assigned case numbers and regular check-in schedules. After he departed, Marcus and I sat in our living room surrounded by the detritus of law enforcement planning, both of us processing the strange reality of our new circumstances. I keep thinking about what Lily said in the car, I told him, curling up against his side on the couch. About families being teams that protect all their players. It's such a simple concept, but Victoria fundamentally doesn't understand it. Marcus wrapped his arm around me, his touch warm and reassuring. Victoria sees relationships as zero-sum competitions, where someone has to lose for her to win. That's why she viewed Lily's academic success as a threat rather than something to celebrate. And it's why she's doubling down on intimidation rather than acknowledging that she made a serious mistake. The next morning brought news that accelerated everything. Dr. Carver called while I was making Lily's lunch, her voice tight with professional concern mixed with personal outrage. Mrs. Harper, I wanted to let you know that Mrs. Brennan showed up at school this morning demanding to speak with Lily. Our security protocol prevented her from entering the building, but she became quite agitated when Officer Kim informed her about the restriction order. My hand tightened on the phone as implications raced through my mind. Did she make any threats? Say anything specific about why she wanted to see Lily? She claimed she wanted to clear the air and help Lily understand that what happened at the awards ceremony was a misunderstanding. When Officer Kim explained that wasn't going to happen, she became verbally aggressive and had to be escorted from the property. The entire interaction was recorded by our security cameras. I thanked Dr. Carver for the notification and immediately called Marcus, who was already in his morning briefing but took my call anyway. Agent Crawford was in his office within 20 minutes, and by noon we were reviewing security footage that showed Victoria's encounter with school officials with crystal clarity. On the screen, Victoria appeared composed initially, her real estate professional persona firmly in place as she approached the school's main entrance. But when Officer Kim intercepted her and explained that she was prohibited from entering school property, her transformation was dramatic and immediate. Her posture shifted, her voice rose to near shouting levels, and her gestures became increasingly aggressive as she demanded access to Lily. Look at the timestamp, Agent Crawford pointed to the corner of the screen. This is happening less than 12 hours after she sent the anonymous intimidation message. She's escalating rapidly, moving from indirect pressure to direct confrontation. The footage continued, showing Victoria pointing aggressively at Officer Kim while making statements we couldn't hear clearly through the security system's audio. Her body language conveyed barely controlled fury, the same explosive anger that had characterized her assault on Lily at the awards ceremony. She's not backing down, Marcus observed, his voice carrying the analytical tone he used when assessing national security threats. She's doubling down on intimidation and attempting to maintain access to Lily, despite being formally prohibited from contact. Agent Crawford paused the video at a moment when Victoria was gesturing emphatically toward the school building. This behavior suggests someone who believes she's entitled to access and control over the child, regardless of legal restrictions or parental wishes. Combined with the anonymous messaging, it indicates a pattern of escalating harassment that could become dangerous if left unchecked. The meeting concluded with enhanced security protocols for both Lily's school and our home, plus formal documentation of Victoria's attempted contact violation that would be added to the growing criminal case against her. What had begun as a single incident of child assault was evolving into a comprehensive pattern of criminal behavior that painted Victoria as someone far more dangerous than I'd initially realized. That afternoon, I received a call from my father that I'd been both expecting and dreading. His voice sounded older than his 68 years, worn down by the stress of watching his marriage implode in real time. "Natalie, honey, we need to talk. Victoria is saying things that don't make sense, making claims about conspiracies and government harassment. I'm starting to think I never really knew who I married." We agreed to meet at Silver Lake Park, the same location where I'd sat processing the morning's revelations just 2 days earlier. The neutral public space felt safer than either of our homes, and the open environment would prevent the kind of ambush conversations that Victoria seemed to favor. My father was waiting on the same bench where I'd watched the ducks, but he looked like a man who'd aged years in the span of days. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them, and his eyes carried the particular exhaustion that comes from constant conflict and stress. "She's not the woman I thought I married," he said without preamble, his voice heavy with the weight of devastating realization. "Yesterday she was screaming at me about how your husband is using government resources to persecute her for disciplining a spoiled child. This morning she was ranting about illegal surveillance and claiming that federal agents are following her." I sat beside him on the bench, noting how he seemed to have shrunk in on himself since the night of the award ceremony. "Dad, I need you to understand something important. Marcus hasn't used any inappropriate government resources in this situation. Everything that's happening is the normal response to an adult assaulting a child in public." He turned to look at me, his expression mixing confusion with growing horror. "She really hit Lily? In front of all those people?" I keep hoping I misunderstood what I saw, that maybe it was less serious than it appeared. "She struck an 8-year-old child across the face hard enough to leave a mark, in front of 200 witnesses at a school awards ceremony," I said quietly. "There's security footage. There are witness statements. And when I tried to talk to her about it yesterday, she showed no remorse whatsoever. She believes her actions were justified." My father buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or exhausted laughter. "I used to tell people that Victoria was the best thing that ever happened to me after your mother died. I thought she brought stability and companionship back into my life. Now I'm wondering if she was just waiting for the right moment to show me who she really was." We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the same ducks I'd observed during my earlier visit paddle contentedly across the lake surface. The normalcy of their routine felt like a small anchor of sanity in the chaos that our family life had become. "There's more," my father said eventually. "Things I should have paid attention to before now. The way she talks about other people when she thinks no one is listening. How she treats service workers at restaurants. The story she tells about her business dealings that always end with her getting the better of someone who deserved to be taken advantage of." The picture he painted was consistent with the background information Marcus had gathered and the professional complaints Grace had uncovered. Victoria had revealed herself gradually, testing boundaries and escalating behavior as she became more comfortable in the relationship. "She's been trying to turn me against you and Lily for months," he continued, his voice gaining strength as he processed his realizations out loud. "Subtle comments about how Lily was spoiled, how you were taking advantage of my generosity, how Marcus probably looked down on our family because we weren't important enough. I thought it was just adjustment difficulties, but now I see it was systematic." A group of children ran past us chasing a soccer ball, their laughter bright and carefree in the afternoon sunshine. The contrast between their innocent joy and the adult complications we were discussing felt stark, and somehow hopeful, a reminder that childhood should be protected from the destructive behavior of troubled adults. "What are you going to do?" I asked gently, though I suspected I already knew the answer. My father straightened his shoulders, and for the first time since the awards ceremony, he looked like the strong, principled man who had raised me to believe in justice and personal responsibility. "I'm going to support my family. I'm going to testify about what I witnessed if the case goes to trial. And I'm going to file for divorce before Victoria can do any more damage to the people I love." The relief that flooded through me was so intense, it was almost physical. I'd been prepared to lose my relationship with my father to protect Lily from Victoria's escalating aggression, but his willingness to face reality and choose family over a destructive marriage offered hope for healing and reconciliation. "Thank you," I said simply, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Lily needs to know that the adults in her life will protect her, even when it's difficult or complicated." We walked back to our cars together, planning practical details about his living situation and legal representation for the divorce proceedings. The conversation felt like the first normal family discussion we'd had since Victoria had entered our lives, free from the careful navigation and diplomatic language that her presence had required. As I drove home, I reflected on how quickly the landscape of our family relationships had shifted. 3 days ago, Victoria had been an unpleasant but tolerated family member whose behavior we worked around for the sake of keeping peace. Today, she was a criminal defendant facing multiple charges whose escalating aggression had united the rest of us in protective opposition. The change felt both sudden and inevitable, as if her assault on Lily had simply crystallized tensions and revealed character traits that had been building beneath the surface for months. Whatever happened in court, our family would emerge from this crisis stronger and more honest about what we would and wouldn't accept from people who claimed to love us. The real reckoning was still ahead, but for the first time since the award ceremony, I felt optimistic about our ability to navigate it successfully. The courthouse steps gleamed in the early morning sunlight as I walked toward what would either be vindication or devastating disappointment. Victoria's arraignment was scheduled for 9 o'clock, and despite Agent Crawford's assurance that the evidence against her was overwhelming, I felt the familiar flutter of nervous energy that had preceded every major court appearance during my prosecutorial career. The difference was that this time, I wasn't the one presenting arguments. I was the mother of the victim, watching from the gallery as justice took its course. Marcus walked beside me, his presence steady and reassuring, despite the early hour and the weight of what we were about to witness. He'd rearranged his morning briefing schedule to be here, understanding that family came before even the most pressing national security matters, when it involved our daughter's safety and well-being. "Remember," he said quietly as we approached the courthouse entrance, "whatever happens in there today, we've done everything right." The evidence speaks for itself, and Victoria's continued escalation has only strengthened the case against her. Inside the courthouse, the familiar atmosphere of legal proceedings felt both comforting and surreal. I'd spent countless hours in similar courtrooms during my career as a federal prosecutor, but being on the other side of the bar rail created a strange sense of displacement. The marble floors and oak-paneled walls that had once represented my professional domain now served as the backdrop for seeking justice for my 8-year-old daughter. District Attorney Sarah Mitchell approached us in the hallway outside Courtroom 3, her expression mixing professional confidence with personal sympathy. Sarah and I had worked together on several federal-state joint prosecutions during my time in the prosecutor's office, and her willingness to personally handle Victoria's case spoke to both the seriousness of the charges and the respect she maintained for our previous professional relationship. "Good morning," she said, shaking hands with both Marcus and me with the firm grip that conveyed competence and determination. "I wanted to brief you on what to expect this morning and let you know that Mrs. Brennan's behavior since the initial incident has significantly strengthened our position." We found seats on a bench outside the courtroom while Sarah explained the morning's proceedings. "The arraignment itself is largely procedural. Mrs. Brennan will be formally informed of the charges against her, advised of her rights, and asked to enter a plea. However, given her recent escalation in behavior, we'll also be requesting enhanced bail conditions that restrict her contact with your family." I nodded. appreciating both the information and Sarah's direct communication style. What additional charges are we looking at beyond the initial assault? Criminal harassment based on the anonymous messaging, violation of the school property restriction order, and potentially intimidation of a witness depending on how aggressively her defense team pursues their strategy, Sarah replied, consulting her notes with the practiced efficiency of someone managing multiple complex cases simultaneously. Each incident has been thoroughly documented, and the pattern of escalation creates a compelling narrative of someone who poses an ongoing threat. The courtroom doors opened precisely at 9 o'clock, and we filed in with the other families, attorneys, and court personnel who comprised the morning's docket. The familiar ritual of standing for the judge's entrance felt both routine and momentous, marking the formal beginning of legal proceedings that would determine Victoria's fate, and, by extension, our family's safety. Judge Patricia Hawkins entered with the measured dignity that characterized her approach to criminal justice, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her eyes. I knew her reputation from my prosecutorial days. Fair but firm, particularly when cases involved violence against children or vulnerable populations. Victoria couldn't have drawn a judge more likely to take her crime seriously. The morning's docket moved efficiently through routine matters until the clerk called Commonwealth versus Victoria Louise Brennan. The sound of Victoria's name being formally announced in open court created a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness, marking the point where family dysfunction had escalated into criminal behavior requiring state intervention. Victoria entered the courtroom flanked by her defense attorney, a thin man in an expensive suit whose nervous energy suggested he understood the challenges ahead. She had clearly invested considerable effort in her appearance, wearing a conservative navy dress and minimal jewelry that projected an image of respectability at odds with her documented behavior. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I could see tension in the rigid set of her shoulders, and the way her hands gripped her purse. "Mrs. Brennan," Judge Hawkins began, her voice carrying the authority of 20 years on the bench, "you are charged with assault in the third degree, criminal harassment, violation of a court order, and attempted intimidation of a witness. How do you plead to these charges?" Victoria's attorney stood slowly, his movement suggesting reluctance to participate in what he clearly recognized as a difficult case. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges and requests release on her own recognizance pending trial." The plea of not guilty was expected, but the request for release without bail conditions demonstrated either spectacular optimism or fundamental misunderstanding of the evidence against Victoria. Sarah Mitchell rose from the prosecution table with the smooth confidence of someone who had prepared thoroughly for this moment. "Your Honor, the Commonwealth objects to release on recognizance and requests specific bail conditions based on the defendant's escalating pattern of harassment and intimidation since the initial assault occurred." What followed was a methodical presentation of Victoria's behavior over the past week, from the original assault through her attempted contact with Lily at school to the anonymous intimidation messages. Sarah presented each incident with clinical precision, building a comprehensive picture of someone whose actions had grown increasingly desperate and potentially dangerous. The defendant struck an 8-year-old child in front of 200 witnesses at a school awards ceremony, Sarah stated, her voice carrying the controlled outrage that effective prosecutors master. When criminal charges were filed, she escalated to anonymous threats and attempted to violate court orders by approaching the victim at her school. This pattern suggests someone who poses an ongoing risk to the safety of the victim and her family. Victoria's attorney attempted a response that emphasized her lack of previous criminal history and community ties, but his arguments felt weak against the documented evidence of escalating harassment. Judge Hawkins listened to both presentations with the patient attention that characterized her approach to complex cases, occasionally making notes, but maintaining the neutral expression that kept attorneys guessing about her thinking. "Mrs. Brennan," the judge said when both attorneys had finished their arguments, "please stand." Victoria rose slowly, her composure finally showing cracks as she faced the reality of judicial scrutiny. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she looked genuinely uncertain, as if the formal legal proceedings had penetrated her conviction that this situation would resolve itself through family negotiation or intimidation tactics. Based on the evidence presented and the documented pattern of escalation, I am setting bail at $50,000 with specific conditions, Judge Hawkins announced, her voice carrying the finality that ended speculation and established new reality. You are prohibited from any contact with the victim or her family, including indirect contact through third parties. You are banned from school property and any location where the victim is known to frequent. Violation of these conditions will result in immediate arrest and detention pending trial. The gavel's impact echoed through the courtroom with the sound of consequences finally catching up with actions. Victoria swayed slightly as the full implications of the judge's orders settled over her, her carefully maintained facade crumbling as she realized that legal procedures wouldn't bend to her will or charm. After the arraignment concluded, Sarah Mitchell walked with us toward the courthouse exit, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal relief. That went as well as we could have hoped, she said, pausing at the top of the courthouse steps. Judge Hawkins clearly understood the seriousness of the situation and the need for protective measures. Marcus nodded, his expression carrying the strategic assessment I'd learned to recognize when he evaluated security situations. The bail conditions essentially create a protective perimeter around our family. If Victoria violates any of them, she'll face immediate detention. I watched Victoria emerge from the courthouse with her attorney, her movements lacking the confident stride that had characterized her entrance. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of formal criminal charges and court-ordered restrictions. Her attorney was speaking urgently into her ear, probably explaining the practical implications of the bail conditions and the serious consequences of any further contact attempts. What happens next? I asked Sarah, though my prosecutorial background had already provided most of the answer. Discovery phase, where both sides exchange evidence and witness lists. Given the strength of our case and the amount of documentation we have, I expect her attorney will push for a plea agreement rather than risk trial, Sarah explained. Most defendants don't want to face a jury when there's video evidence of them assaulting a child. The drive home felt different from our morning journey to the courthouse. The formal arraignment had transformed Victoria from a family problem into a criminal defendant subject to court supervision and legal consequences. The bail conditions created a protective barrier around our family that would allow us to begin healing from the trauma of her assault on Lily. That afternoon, I sat in Dr. Rebecca Chen's office with Lily, continuing the therapy sessions we'd initiated after the awards ceremony incident. Dr. Chen specialized in childhood trauma and had extensive experience helping young victims process experiences of adult violence and betrayal. Her calm demeanor and child-friendly office had already begun helping Lily make sense of what had happened to her. "How are you feeling about the grown-up meeting that happened this morning?" Dr. Chen asked Lily, using the age-appropriate language we'd developed to discuss court proceedings without overwhelming her with legal complexity. Lily swung her legs from the oversized chair, her expression thoughtful as she considered the question. "I think it's good that Victoria has to follow rules now. Mom says that when people make bad choices, they have to have consequences so they can learn better ways to behave." The sophisticated emotional reasoning continued to amaze me. Despite being the victim of an unprovoked assault, Lily was processing the situation with remarkable maturity and insight, viewing even criminal consequences through the lens of learning opportunities rather than punishment. "Sometimes adults make choices that hurt children," Dr. Chen said gently. "And when that happens, other adults have to step in to make sure everyone stays safe." "It sounds like you understand that what happened to you wasn't your fault." Lily nodded seriously. "Ms. Peterson at school said that when someone hits you, it's never because of something you did wrong. It's because they have problems inside themselves that they don't know how to handle properly." After our therapy session, Lily and I stopped at the craft store to pick up supplies for an art project she wanted to complete. The normalcy of browsing through aisles of construction paper and glue sticks felt therapeutic after the morning's intensity, a reminder that childhood activities and simple pleasures continued despite adult complications. In the parking lot, I noticed a familiar green sedan that made my pulse quicken with alarm. Victoria's car was parked 3 spaces away from ours, and I could see her silhouette behind the wheel. apparently watching the store entrance. The violation of her bail conditions was so blatant and immediate that I momentarily wondered if I was misinterpreting what I was seeing. "Lily, sweetheart, I need you to stay very close to me and walk quickly to our car," I said, keeping my voice calm while reaching for my phone to call both Marcus and Agent Crawford. "Don't look around or wave at anyone. Just focus on getting to our car safely." My daughter sensed the tension in my voice and responded with the serious attention she gave to important instructions. We reached our car without incident, but Victoria's presence in the parking lot represented such a clear violation of her bail conditions that I knew this would trigger immediate legal consequences. Marcus answered on the first ring, his voice sharp with concern when I explained the situation. "Are you and Lily safe? Can you see her clearly enough to be certain it's Victoria? We're in our car and about to leave, and yes, it's definitely her. She's parked where she can observe everyone entering and leaving the craft store, which Lily and I visit regularly. This feels like deliberate surveillance rather than coincidence." Agent Crawford's response was even more immediate. He was in the area and arrived at the shopping center within 10 minutes, just as Victoria was pulling out of her parking space. The timing suggested she'd been waiting specifically for us to leave, confirming that this was targeted harassment rather than accidental encounter. By evening, Victoria was back in custody, arrested for violating her bail conditions less than 8 hours after being released from the courthouse. The speed and obviousness of her violations surprised even Sarah Mitchell, who called to update us on the afternoon's developments. "I've seen defendants make poor decisions after arraignment, but this level of immediate and blatant violation is unusual," Sarah said, her voice mixing professional amazement with personal frustration. "It suggests someone who either doesn't understand the seriousness of court orders or believes she's above legal consequences." Marcus set the phone to speaker so we could both hear Sarah's assessment. "What does this mean for the overall case?" "It significantly strengthens our position and eliminates any possibility of plea negotiation for reduced charges," Sarah replied. "Her attorney will have a much harder time arguing that she poses no ongoing threat when she violated court orders within hours of being released. Judge Hawkins doesn't look kindly on defendants who treat her orders as suggestions." That night, after Lily was asleep and the house had settled into its familiar evening quiet, Marcus and I sat in our kitchen reviewing the day's events and their implications. The swift escalation from arraignment to bail violation to rearrest felt almost surreal in its speed, but it had effectively resolved any remaining doubts about Victoria's character and intentions. "She could have walked away," Marcus said, staring out the window at our peaceful suburban neighborhood. "After the arraignment, she could have accepted the consequences of her actions, followed the court orders, and potentially negotiated a plea agreement for reduced charges. Instead, she chose to escalate." I poured myself a cup of tea, needing the ritual comfort of warm liquid and familiar motions. I think she genuinely believed she could intimidate us into backing down. When that didn't work, she convinced herself that surveillance and continued harassment would somehow force us to withdraw the charges. The irony was that Victoria's continued aggression had accomplished the opposite of her apparent goals. Instead of pressuring us to retreat, her escalating behavior had strengthened our resolve and provided additional evidence for prosecutors to use against her. Her inability to accept consequences had transformed a single assault charge into a comprehensive criminal case with multiple felony counts. My phone buzzed with a text from my father, who had been notified of Victoria's arrest by her attorney. "I can't believe she violated court orders the same day she was released. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow morning. This has to end." The message carried relief mixed with sadness. Relief that my father was finally seeing Victoria's true nature and choosing to protect his family, but sadness that his marriage had devolved into criminal behavior and legal proceedings. At 68 years old, he was facing the collapse of a relationship he'd hoped would provide companionship and stability in his later years. I texted back, "You're making the right choice. Lily and I love you, and we'll get through this together as a family." His response was immediate. "I should have listened to my instincts months ago. I love you both too." The next morning brought news that Victoria's defense attorney had withdrawn from her case, citing irreconcilable differences about legal strategy. The move was unusual but not unprecedented when defendants refused to follow legal counsel and continued engaging in behavior that undermined their own defense. Sarah Mitchell called to explain the implications. Her attorney probably advised her to accept responsibility, follow court orders, and negotiate a plea agreement. When she chose to violate bail conditions instead, he realized she wasn't going to listen to professional advice. Most attorneys won't continue representing clients who actively sabotage their own cases. The withdrawal meant that Victoria would need to find new legal representation or potentially face trial with a court-appointed public defender. Either option would likely delay proceedings while new counsel familiarized themselves with the case. But it also meant that her legal team would be starting from a significantly weakened position. Does this affect our timeline for resolution? I asked, thinking about the impact of delays on Lily's emotional recovery and our family's ability to move forward. Potentially, but not necessarily in a negative way, Sarah replied. The delay gives us more time to document any additional violations or harassment attempts, and it means her new attorney will be working with a much stronger prosecution case than originally existed. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Grace Romano, with information that added another dimension to our understanding of Victoria's behavior. I heard about yesterday's arrest, and it made me think we should dig deeper into her background. I called a friend who works in criminal justice records, and what we found is disturbing. Grace's investigation had uncovered a sealed juvenile record that included multiple instances of aggressive behavior toward other children, including one incident that had required hospitalization of another student. The pattern of violence toward vulnerable individuals stretched back decades, suggesting that her assault on Lily wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a long-standing behavioral pattern. The records are sealed because she was a minor when these incidents occurred, Grace explained. But they're admissible for sentencing purposes if she's convicted of the current charges. It means this isn't a case of poor judgment under stress. It's evidence of ongoing antisocial behavior that has persisted into adulthood. The revelation felt both shocking and somehow inevitable. Victoria's complete lack of remorse after striking Lily, combined with her immediate escalation to harassment and intimidation, now made more sense in the context of a lifetime pattern of violence toward people she perceived as threats or obstacles. Marcus reviewed the information that evening with the analytical approach he brought to intelligence assessments. This changes our understanding of what we're dealing with, he said, spreading Grace's research across our kitchen table. We're not looking at someone who made a single poor decision. We're looking at someone with a documented history of violence, who has learned to mask her behavior in professional and social settings. The implications were both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it provided context for Victoria's behavior and suggested that our protective measures were appropriate and necessary. Terrifying because it indicated that someone with a pattern of violence had been living in close proximity to our family for 2 years, with access to Lily and opportunity to cause harm. At least now we understand why she escalated so quickly, I said, studying the timeline of incidents Grace had documented. This is who she's always been. The professional facade and social charm were just tools to access new victims and situations where she could exercise control. As we prepared for bed that night, I felt a strange sense of closure beginning to settle over the chaos of the past week. Victoria's mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the disturbed individual who had been hiding beneath the surface of suburban respectability. Our family's safety was secured by court orders and law enforcement supervision, and the legal system was methodically building a case that would ensure appropriate consequences for her actions. The real battle had been won not in dramatic confrontations or emotional appeals, but through careful documentation, professional competence, and unwavering commitment to protecting an innocent child from adult violence. Victoria had underestimated both our resources and our determination, and that miscalculation would define the remainder of her legal proceedings. The path forward was clear, and for the first time since the awards ceremony, I felt confident that justice would prevail. 6 months later, I stood in the same courthouse where Victoria's legal troubles had begun, but this time the atmosphere was one of resolution rather than uncertainty. The plea hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock, and Sarah Mitchell had called that morning to confirm that Victoria's new attorney had finally accepted the prosecution's terms. After months of failed motions, rejected appeals, and mounting evidence, even Victoria's most optimistic legal representation had concluded that trial would result in significantly harsher consequences than the negotiated settlement. Lily walked beside me with the confident stride of a child who had processed trauma through excellent therapy and family support. Dr. Chen had pronounced her remarkably resilient during our final session the week before, noting that she developed sophisticated coping mechanisms and maintained her fundamental trust in family relationships despite experiencing adult betrayal. The certificate from her spring mathematics competition was framed in her bedroom, a reminder that achievements couldn't be diminished by the poor behavior of troubled adults. Marcus joined us in the courthouse lobby, having rearranged another morning briefing to be present for the formal conclusion of Victoria's criminal case. His support throughout the ordeal had been unwavering, but I could see relief in his expression as we approached the end of legal proceedings that had dominated our family life for months. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" he asked Lily, crouching down to her eye level with the gentle attention he'd shown since becoming her stepfather. "Ready for it to be over," she replied with the straightforward honesty that characterized her approach to difficult situations. Dr. Chen says that when people face consequences for their bad choices, it helps everyone move forward and feel safer. The wisdom of her response never ceased to amaze me. At 9 years old, she understood concepts of justice and accountability that many adults struggled to grasp, viewing even criminal proceedings through the lens of learning opportunities and community healing rather than punishment and revenge. Sarah Mitchell approached us near the courtroom entrance, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal relief. The case had been more complex and time-consuming than initially anticipated, but Victoria's continued poor decisions had provided additional evidence that strengthened rather than weakened the prosecution's position. Victoria's attorney contacted me this morning to confirm acceptance of the plea agreement, Sarah reported, consulting her notes with the practiced efficiency that had characterized her handling of the case. 3 years in state prison, 5 years supervised probation upon release, mandatory anger management and psychological counseling, and a permanent restraining order protecting your family from any future contact. The terms were more severe than I'd initially expected, but Victoria's escalating behavior and documented history of violence had convinced Judge Hawkins that standard sentencing guidelines were insufficient to ensure public safety. The permanent restraining order, in particular, provided long-term protection that would extend well into Lily's teenage years. "What about restitution for Lily's therapy costs and the security measures we had to implement?" Marcus asked, his question reflecting both practical concerns and his belief that accountability should include financial responsibility for harm caused. Included in the plea agreement, Sarah confirmed, $25,000 in restitution to cover therapeutic services, security consultations, and related expenses. The court will supervise payment during her probation period. As we entered the courtroom for what would hopefully be the final hearing in Victoria's case, I reflected on how dramatically our family dynamics had shifted over the past months. What had begun as a crisis threatening to tear apart relationships had ultimately strengthened our bonds and clarified our priorities in ways that felt both painful and necessary. My father had finalized his divorce from Victoria 2 months earlier, a process that had revealed additional disturbing aspects of her character, including financial manipulation and systematic isolation tactics. He'd moved into a modest apartment near our neighborhood and was slowly rebuilding his relationship with Lily, their grandfather-granddaughter bond healing from the damage Victoria's presence had inflicted. The courtroom was less crowded than during the arraignment, with only the essential participants present for the formal plea acceptance. Victoria entered wearing the orange jumpsuit of someone who had been held without bail since her multiple violations of court orders, her appearance dramatically different from the polished real estate professional who had first been charged 6 months earlier. Her transformation was striking not just in terms of clothing and grooming, but in the defeat that seemed to emanate from her posture and expression. The confident woman who had believed she could intimidate her way out of consequences had been replaced by someone who finally understood that actions had irreversible results that couldn't be negotiated or manipulated. Judge Hawkins reviewed the plea agreement with the thorough attention she brought to all significant legal documents, asking clarifying questions that ensured everyone understood the terms and their long-term implications. When she asked Victoria directly whether she understood and accepted the consequences outlined in the agreement, the response was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor. I accept the terms." The words carried none of the defiance or entitlement that had characterized Victoria's earlier appearances, Whether her change in attitude reflected genuine remorse or simply recognition that further resistance was futile remained unclear, but the result was the same: formal acknowledgement of guilt and acceptance of substantial consequences. "Mrs. Brennan," Judge Hawkins said, her voice carrying the gravity appropriate to criminal sentencing, "this court wants to be absolutely clear about the permanent nature of the restraining order included in this agreement. You are prohibited from any contact, direct or indirect, with the Harper family for the remainder of your natural life. This includes physical proximity, electronic communication, social media interaction, and contact through third parties. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and additional criminal charges." The finality of the judge's words seemed to settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket, marking the end of Victoria's ability to cause fear or disruption in our family's life. As she was led away by court officers to begin serving her sentence, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and closure that was difficult to articulate. Outside the courthouse, Sarah Mitchell shook hands with our family with the satisfaction of someone who had achieved justice for a vulnerable victim. "This case will serve as precedent for prosecuting adult violence against children in our jurisdiction," she said. Victoria's escalating behavior provided clear evidence that initial leniency would have been inappropriate and potentially dangerous. The drive home took us through familiar neighborhoods that felt somehow different now that the threat of Victoria's unpredictable presence had been permanently removed. Lily chattered about her upcoming summer plans, including a mathematics camp that would challenge her academic abilities, and a weekend hiking trip with Marcus that had become their special bonding tradition. "Can we go to the ice cream shop to celebrate?" she asked as we pulled into our driveway. "Not because Victoria got in trouble, but because our family is safe and we don't have to worry about her anymore." The distinction she drew between celebration and vindictiveness demonstrated the emotional sophistication that therapy and family support had helped her develop. She understood that justice wasn't about revenge but about protection and the restoration of safety for vulnerable people. At the ice cream shop, we encountered Mrs. Patterson, Lily's former kindergarten teacher, who had followed the case through local news coverage and school district communications. Her greeting was warm but respectful, acknowledging what our family had endured without dwelling on details that might be uncomfortable for Lily. "I heard that everything worked out well in court today," she said, crouching down to Lily's level with the genuine interest she'd always shown in her students' well-being. "How are you feeling about starting 4th grade in the fall?" Lily's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "I'm excited about the advanced mathematics program, and maybe joining the chess club. Ms. Rodriguez says that learning new things helps your brain grow stronger, like exercise for your thinking." The conversation continued for several minutes, focusing on academic plans and summer activities rather than legal proceedings or family trauma. Mrs. Patterson's skillful navigation of the interaction provided Lily with positive adult attention that reinforced her sense of worth and potential rather than her identity as a victim. That evening, as we sat on our back patio watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Marcus and I discussed the long-term implications of the day's resolution. The criminal case was concluded, but the emotional healing and family reconstruction would continue for months or years to come. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if we hadn't taken a strong stand immediately," I said, watching Lily play with her neighbor friends in our backyard. "If we'd tried to handle Victoria's assault as a family matter rather than recognizing it as criminal behavior." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his expression reflecting the strategic analysis he brought to complex situations. "She would have interpreted any hesitation as weakness and escalated her behavior until someone got seriously hurt. The documentation we gathered and the legal consequences we pursued probably prevented much worse outcomes." The truth of his assessment was sobering but reassuring. Victoria's pattern of escalating violence, revealed through Grace's background investigation and her subsequent violations of court orders, suggested that leniency would have been interpreted as permission to continue aggressive behavior toward our family. A week later, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through Sarah Mitchell's office. Victoria had written from prison, her handwriting neat but somehow diminished on the institutional stationery. The letter was brief and formal, acknowledging responsibility for her actions and expressing what appeared to be genuine remorse for the harm she'd caused. I understand now that my behavior was inexcusable, and that I caused real trauma to an innocent child, she wrote. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm participating in counseling programs and trying to understand why I acted so destructively toward people who deserved kindness. I read the letter twice, searching for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda, but the tone seemed genuinely reflective rather than strategic. Whether Victoria's apparent insight would lead to lasting behavioral change remained to be seen, but the acknowledgement of harm was more than she'd offered during months of legal proceedings. I showed the letter to Marcus and discussed it with Dr. Chen during a follow-up appointment, but ultimately decided not to share it with Lily. My daughter had processed the trauma and moved forward with remarkable resilience, and there seemed no benefit to reopening emotional wounds with communications from her attacker, regardless of their apparent sincerity. 3 months into the school year, Lily received another Mathematics Excellence Award, this time at a district-wide competition that recognized exceptional student achievement across multiple elementary schools. As she walked confidently across the auditorium stage to receive her certificate, I was struck by how different this ceremony felt from the one where Victoria had shattered our family's peace. This time, the audience consisted entirely of people who celebrated Lily's success without reservation or hidden resentment. My father sat beside Marcus and me, his pride in his granddaughter, evident in his broad smile and enthusiastic applause. The complicated family dynamics that had characterized our relationships during Victoria's presence had been replaced by straightforward love and support. After the ceremony, as we gathered for photos and congratulations, Dr. Carver approached our family with the warm smile that had characterized her support throughout our ordeal. "It's wonderful to see Lily thriving academically and personally," she said. "She's become a real leader among her peers, helping other students who are struggling and showing remarkable empathy for children facing difficulties." The observation that Lily had transformed her own experience of victimization into advocacy for other vulnerable children felt like the ultimate vindication of our decision to pursue justice rather than family diplomacy. She had learned that adults who truly cared about children would protect them from harm, and she was now extending that protection to her classmates. As we drove home from the awards ceremony, I thought about the journey our family had traveled from crisis to healing. The attack that had initially seemed like it might destroy our relationships had ultimately strengthened them by forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths and make difficult choices based on principles rather than convenience. "Mom," Lily said from the back seat, interrupting my reflection, "I'm glad that Victoria had to face consequences for hitting me. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because it showed me that adults will protect children when bad things happen." Her words captured the essence of why we'd fought so hard for accountability and justice. The legal proceedings hadn't been about punishment or revenge, but about demonstrating to a vulnerable child that her safety and dignity mattered more than adult comfort or family politics. That night, as I tucked Lily into bed and listened to her excited planning for the next day's activities, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the strength our family had discovered during its darkest period. We had faced a crisis that could have destroyed our relationships and instead emerged with deeper bonds and clearer priorities. The mathematics certificate from the district competition joined the others on Lily's bedroom wall, a growing collection of achievements that reflected her academic talent and personal resilience. Victoria's attempt to diminish her had instead revealed her remarkable character and potential, proving that children's spirits could triumph over adult cruelty when supported by love and justice. Looking back on the entire experience, from that terrible evening at the school awards ceremony to the peaceful resolution of criminal proceedings, I realized that sometimes the worst moments in our lives force us to discover strengths we never knew we possessed. Victoria's assault on Lily had been a devastating betrayal, but our response had demonstrated the power of family unity, professional competence, and unwavering commitment to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The real victory wasn't Victoria's imprisonment or our family's legal vindication. The real victory was Lily's continued faith in the goodness of family relationships, and her growing confidence that she was worthy of protection and love. That faith would serve her well as she navigated the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead in her bright future. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.